Okay then. We'll make a start. Thank you. Again, as is traditional at the beginning of every lecture, you go, we're supposed to start at 8 o'clock at 10 past. I always forget. So we'll cut the difference and start at 6 minutes. Okay, so welcome to this last session that I'm going to give you for your research dissertation. For those of you on Learning Central, then yes, you can access the PowerPoint, obviously. But I just want to say that if you access that PowerPoint before today, it's a slightly different lecture thing than, so I can't upload it this morning, so there's just a couple of minor differences, which I think is important because for one small point I will make later on, okay? So please refer to the ones that I'm delivering today. Okay, so yeah, welcome to this final session I'm going to give you for your research dissertation. And in this today's session, I'm more than happy to take any questions that you've got, any troubleshooting issues that have popped up since last time we met, or if you've not been able to see your supervisor because of the context in which we are living in this week and next week. But what primarily I want to do today is talk about some issues about the submission of your work in January, things that you need to do, to the bells and whistles that are associated with doing a dissertation that makes it ultimately a dissertation product. And prior to that, talk about the introduction and the conclusion, the last key elements of your piece of work. So hopefully you'll be in a situation with the last couple of weeks of supervision, and I'll go through the details about that, and then the time you have when the semester or the teaching bit of the semester finishes up until the submission deadline. You'll have everything that you need to finish off this incredibly exciting piece of work. Okay, so where have we been? So we are here, and this is where we've been throughout the semester. Mostly you've steered the ship yourself, hopefully with some help from your supervisor, with a bit of support from these lectures, from the online materials, etc., etc. And remember that through the wonder of Learn Plus recordings and Learning Central, you can go back to all the details that, if you've forgotten anything about any of these sections, as you need it over the next month or so. As well as that on Learning Central, there is a copy, of your dissertation handbook. So it's a whole kind of Bible of all the kind of minutiae and stuff that you need. So don't feel as if, even when it gets to the end of supervision, etc., that you are unsupported. If you use a little bit of common sense and just look at the materials that have been provided with the notion that these are going to be helpful to you, then the stuff will be there if you look for it. Okay, so although, as I've said throughout the sessions, everyone's going to be at slightly different stages, and that is fine. But as we're getting towards the end, maybe you've done a draft of the lit review and your methodology, maybe these are back from your supervisor, or maybe they are in the process of being given back, depending on whether they're industrial action, etc. And you're well into your empirical chapters, getting your teeth into how you're going to articulate the findings that you have developed through your secondary and your primary data. Some of you may have got that done already, and they're with your supervisor, or even got responses from them. But that's the sort of broad stage you're in. So we're moving into week 9 of the semester, including reading week, so week 8 of teaching. There's 2 more weeks after this. Perhaps it's the right time to begin thinking about the last 2 key chapters that you're going to be working on in your dissertation, the introduction and your conclusion. Before we get onto that, I just want to confirm with you some of the changes that have happened as a response to the industrial action that is disrupting your teaching and learning experience this week and during next week. So, the first point of that is that there is a new submission deadline for your dissertation, the ultimate date in which you need to get this submitted. It used to be Wednesday the 8th, I think, Wednesday the 9th? The Wednesday, and now it's the following Monday. Okay? So Monday the 13th is the deadline that you need to get it in. So that's an acknowledgement by the school that, to some extent or other, your supervision and your work on your dissertation could have been disrupted as a consequence of the industrial action. We acknowledge that for different people it's going to be disrupted in different ways and to different extents. So it is a relatively small extension, but it's done that with a view that some of you might have exams in January as well. So if we delay it any longer, then you'll be into the revision time, you'll be for your dissertation, and for those people who, for your exams. For those of you who may have exams, we don't want you to feel any extra anxiety in relation to that as a consequence of a well-meaning but perhaps too late extension of your dissertation. Okay? So I'll come back to that as we go through in the final kind of third of today's session. There's also, I'm getting warmed up now, a new supervision deadline too. So, before the advent of industrial action, you could have submitted any work that you have to your supervisor up until the last day of teaching. And your supervisors would have the following week to get that response back to you. Because some of you may not be able to talk to your supervisor this week and for a little bit of next week, everything might have been kind of shunted into that last couple of weeks of teaching. So we're softening that Friday deadline. So as long as you talk to your supervisor about it, it's now okay and they will accept work from you after that last Friday of teaching. But it is up until Friday the 22nd. That's the last date that you can ask them to look at anything or they will give you any responses, okay? I understand the just slight difference there. I will confirm that when the industrial action finishes to all staff members, so they know about it, but I will remind them, might have forgotten over the course if they've been striking, that they can accept work from you up until the 22nd of December. But clearly, if you give it them on the 21st and ask them to turn it around in 24 hours, they might not be around that day, or they may have lots of other stuff to do that day. So it's really important that as soon as possible you liaise with your supervisor about the nature of the stuff that you still have outstanding and a timeline for getting that to your supervisor so you can get the feedback that you need up until the 22nd. So it's going to be really different for different people. And that's kind of fine. Each of you have seen your supervisor to a certain extent or to a lesser extent, etc., etc. You'll have a general understanding of how much time you've still got left to see your supervisor and a general understanding of how many jobs of work you still have to do, where you are at certain stages with certain drafts of each of your chapters. So, talk to your supervisor as soon as you can. Next week, if they're not striking immediately, Thursday, Friday, whatever, suggest meetings with them on certain dates to say, okay, I know I've got 3 chapters you need to see. Could I see you here, here, and here? And I will send you work 24 hours, 48 hours before in order that they can see them and so you can get exactly what you need. So if up until this point you've been slightly nervous about being proactive with your supervisor and just saying, please can I have a meeting? And then just being quiet and maybe, now's the time to step up and say, actually, from my perspective, it would be great if we can meet here, perhaps at these times, and then at those times, and then at those times. For example, could you let me know as soon as possible whether this would be possible or suggest other dates? Okay? Any questions about that? Yeah.
Do you know when the exam dates will be released?
It's not something that's within the school's power, unfortunately. Well, I can find out from student services whether we've been informed of that yet. All we know is that they're in that time frame. So yes, I suppose it is possible for them to be on that Monday. But I would imagine it's unlikely, so that's why we've moved it to then. Of course, if you want to submit sooner, you can. If you want to work to the Friday or the original date, this is kind of the point that I'm getting to now. You can be really quite, or reduce your passivity saying, well, these are the deadlines that I'm working to because these are the ones I've been given. Well, actually, I'm going to work to other ones because it just suits me and my modules that I'm taking, the amount of credits that I'm working on this semester, the other jobs that I've got on outside my academic life, etc., etc. So yes, really try to be as engaged and as constructive about this as possible. So, in summary, there's a slightly new supervision deadline, so translate that into your own situation. What work is outstanding? What bits am I unsure about? What bits can my supervisor directly help with? What support can I get in through other ways, through virtually or going back to these lecture series, etc., etc. And work out how you're going to work through the time that you have available with your supervisor up until the 22nd of December. All right? Okay, brilliant. So, where are we at with the job of work thus far? Well, if you remember back to the kind of broad outline of what a dissertation is that I introduced to you much earlier in the module, we have a number of chapters: the intro, the lit review, the methodology, a number of analysis chapters that you might have a number, you might have 1, you might have 3, you might have 16, probably unlikely 16. You'll have probably one that connects directly to the number of questions that you have. Okay? You might decide to deal with all of your questions in one big chapter, and that is completely fine. But effectively you'll have mini sections within one big chapter. It's just a way of separating and sequencing the nature of the job so it doesn't seem so overwhelming. The bit I want to draw your attention to is the top and the bottom in red, the introduction and the conclusion. You will note, these are the chapters we're going to be looking at today. You'll also note that I've got a number of indicative word counts that are associated with these chapters that we talked about when we started the module. Now, you may have paid less attention to them because it's getting towards the business end and you're thinking, how many words am I writing for my empirical? It's growing, or it's not, whatever it happens to be. I want to reassure you in the fact that these are purely indicative, okay? Everybody's will look different. It doesn't matter hugely that you've got 10, 20, 50, 100, 200, 500, 1,000 words difference between you and your colleague sitting next to you about this. Everybody's will look and feel differently. I think this is what, and bearing that in mind is important when we think about the introduction and conclusion. I'm going to tell you what is normal for an introduction and conclusion, but within the context of this, in the context that your introduction and conclusion are almost like your buffers in your dissertation. They can expand and contract depending on how much space this stuff needs. So although I've given you indicative word lengths here, this is just purely indicative. I have my own personal taste about what I would want to put in an introduction and conclusion, but if I can imagine many, many other versions of dissertations where what I think would be normal wouldn't necessarily suit those dissertations. Okay? So if your introduction ends up being 1,500 and your conclusion ends up 1,500, that's completely fine. Because they're expanding to do work because you've not put that data inside your empirical chapters. Okay? Other people might say, I don't want to put that in my empirical chapters. I've got some big, hefty things I want to say about the significance of vegetarianism in society or whatever I'm doing. And I want to say that for my conclusion. That's fine. Your conclusion will be bigger. Someone else's conclusion will be a little bit smaller. Okay? So again, it's that I can mould and shape this general structure to suit my own work, and that is fine. You're just doing it within an informed way, okay? That's the key thing. There's lots of other ways you kind of can describe this. You know, we could all kind of go into a fashion shop and choose a whole range of clothes, but we will wear them differently, yeah? And the person, they're just making it bespoke. You're just making this dissertation your own. So this is the generic order, and you will individualize it, okay? But what is important is that we acknowledge that there are introduction and conclusion chapters, and they have a particular function. And I'm going to go through that in the next few slides. Okay. So if you remember way back to Easter time-ish, when you wrote your research proposal, many of you may have approached that subject or assumed that you should approach that subject knowing precisely what your dissertation is going to be about. But with hindsight, now you're X many months through that process, you might go, actually, it's great because my dissertation is really similar to what I set out to achieve. But I'm guessing many of you will go, actually, my dissertation is really different from what I thought I was going to do when I began. And actually, even going through your empirical chapters. That's often when you're developing those and you're going through, almost with a fine-tooth comb, the responses that you've got from your surveys or from your focus groups or your interviews. You're thinking, oh, it's about this. I didn't realise it was about this. This is a really important thing that I thought was really marginal. I didn't even notice it back in Easter. I know I've got some emails from some of you saying, actually, I've discovered something through my empirical. Does that mean I have to go back and put some extra stuff in your lit review? And yeah, you're kind of discovering it as you're going. And so this is why this process of kind of ongoing discovery of almost the dissertation is taking its own life, and not taking its own life in terms of, becoming its own thing, getting life through the process of writing it, is why we leave the introduction and conclusion chapters at the end, because it's only now that you really know what it is you're really writing about. And just as I was looking at something completely different this week, this is a quotation that I came across from Turchi's book about books and cartography and maps, etc., etc. But it nicely alludes to this process of it's only maybe now that you really know what your dissertation is about, and that's what you need to put back in your introduction chapter. Articulation, as Gibbon said, becomes the knowing, the writing, the working through, the bringing together your interview quotations, putting the data together and trying to explain, this is about. Articulating your data becomes knowing about what your data is, and by extension, what your dissertation's really about. The knowing comes out of the process. It doesn't start, this is what my dissertation's going to be. Sometimes it happens that way, but not often. Through the process, oh yeah, this is what it's about. And because the knowing comes out of the process, then you then go, oh yeah, this is what it's about, or I can write about it this way now. I can restate my title. I could even slightly restate my questions if I wanted to. This is the time when you go through and do that. I know this is rather wonderful vocabulary for something as perhaps prosaic as a dissertation, but it does get at this process a sense of ecstatic fruitfulness. Steady. Of rich discoveries, of voyaging, comes to us in the exhilarating moments of being in our work in progress. I'm sure some of us have gone, that's what I found out about when I was doing my travels around Southeast Asia, or looking into veganism, or, I don't know, being in a radio studio, or being on a beach. Just some of the students that, that's what this is about. This is what I've discovered. I am part of a work in progress. I am fueling this. I'm kind of steering this ship, etc., etc. And maybe you've had a sense of ecstatic fruitfulness through this process, of a rich discovery. The point of the introduction chapter is try to sum up what it is your dissertation has come to be about. It doesn't need to be a statement about what it was when you started. It's a right here, right now, looking at the data. Having written it, I now need to convey to my reader why they should care. Why should they be interested? What is the spatial phenomena I have realised that I'm now interested in? The theories that I'm going to use, the methods that I'm going to use. The introduction is the potted greatest hits. It's not the whole album, it's just kind of in the equivalent of 3 minutes. This is what we're going to be looking at. That's what you seek to do. And of course, it can be a little bit larger or a little bit smaller, depending on the other work that your dissertation is doing. So, here are some of the key things that, in my view, your introduction needs to cover. What is the spatial phenomena that you're now engaging with? What's the focus of the study? What's the background of that study? What's its context? How has it come to prominence? Almost, why were you interested in this in the first place? That might also be a good point to bring in your own positionality in relation to it, if you think that's important. If you think that being a student, studying young people, was of relevance, then say, well, that's what got me interested in it, because this thing was happening in my world, in my local area, in my student life. This is what I was doing in the summer. I am connected to this work, and I'm putting myself right in the heart of it. And you can return to that. It's one of your first one of your callbacks when you discuss it in more detail in your methodology. From that broad spatial phenomenon, what particular things are you interested in? Restate your research questions in their newly changed form as a consequence of what your empirical chapter wishes to do. And then you also need to talk about what's your approach to those questions. That might be relatively formal, like I am taking broadly a feminist approach. Remembering back to your geographical ideas lectures, you might be taking a particular philosophical approach to understanding that. When you look at this sort of, when it explains what you do in an introduction chapter in textbooks, that's what it tends to remind us. But in general, you guys haven't really taken a particular theoretical approach. I'm taking a post-structural understanding of ... Some of you may do, but I'm not sure that will resonate directly with each of your approaches. What this is really getting at is, am I taking a social constructivist approach? I.e., what broad philosophy is informing your methodology? Okay, am I looking for facts and frequencies? Am I looking for views and interpretations? As we talked about in the methodology chapter, that implies a particular onto-epistemological perspective. And you can simply refer to that to introduce your reader. Think, this is what I'm going to get. When I read the next 10,000 words, this is what I'm expecting. Okay? You know, I introduced very briefly your methods. I'm going to use focus groups or surveys. I did a thing with a particular case study of young people or a particular geographical case study, etc., etc. Again, so the reader just knows what it is they're expecting. Okay, you're interested in this. So the reader's starting from it cold. Oh, so you're doing that and that's, oh, that's interesting. You're asking this question, that's good. I wonder what methods they're going to do. Oh, they're going to do these methods. Oh, that makes sense from this perspective. Right, okay, and how is this dissertation going to continue? Oh, here's a roadmap of how it goes on. A thesis outline, signposting what each chapter is going to do and why to the reader. This is very much a conventional approach to a introduction chapter. And you can tell that you could expand and contract each of these things. You could probably, if you really wanted to and you had no space at all, get this done in about a page and a half, right? Which is probably a lot less than 1,000 words, okay? But you could actually, if you wanted to do more and say more about, let's say, your case study in your introduction chapter, then, okay, I'll do it there, and then I don't have to do it again in my methodology chapter. Okay, it's got to go somewhere, but you might decide you're going to put it in the intro rather than that, and that's completely fine. So you can expand and contract and omit and these sort of areas. Okay. Any questions about that? I'm going to work through those things just in a particular example. So this, actually, I tried to remember my own undergraduate dissertation, and this was it. All right? So the changing nature of environmental protest, a case study of Twyford Down. Maybe a lot of your dissertation titles might fit this. A subject and then a case study. That's kind of a relatively straightforward way of setting up a title. So if that was my dissertation, how would I go through the things that I've just said are really important to do in your introduction for this subject? So what's the spatial phenomena I'm engaging with? Okay, well, that requires me to elaborate a little bit about the title, which you guys are completely experts at now, because that's what you've done in every essay you've ever done. Your introduction chapter has thought about the title, thought about the keywords, and introduced them to a certain extent. So in this case, okay, well, I'm looking at environmental protest at Twyford Down. So Twyford Down's a particular area in Hampshire. So that's obviously my case study. So is that the really significant thing? Oh, I think it's one of them. I can decide whether I'm going to discuss that here or discuss that slightly later when I introduce my case study. I'm also talking about environmental protest. So I need to introduce the reader to the context in relation to environmental protest and why that might be important. But also, I would push myself further and say, well, actually, this is the changing nature of environmental protest is one of those, for those of you who did cultural geography with me last year, one of those things. Thinking about protest is changing, but it's protest about nature. So the nature of nature is changing as well. So there's some double meanings going on there. Maybe I need to introduce them in my title too. So it could be the case study is interesting, the phenomena is interesting, and what the phenomena is about is interesting. The who's, the what, the how's. Who, what, how, why, where. The significance of all this stuff. So what's going on? I was arguing that environmental protest in recent years has changed. We need to understand the nature of this change. Why are people protesting in the way that they are? What are they protesting about? Why are they protesting about it in that way instead of writing to their MP or doing a more conventional type of protest? What significance does this have? Does it matter where they're doing it? The Twyford Down is thing. Could it have been about anything? Or is it this? Particularly it was about road building. So, okay, well, I need to talk about transport policy at some point in my thesis. You're flagging up initially all the different aspects that you think are important that are going to gain your reader's attention. Now, you're kind of lucky in that the people who are reading your dissertation are going to be super interested in human geography and planning. But you have to kind of pretend that you're reading it for someone who you've got to convince. You need to be reading this. This is super exciting. So, introduce that in the opening paragraph. What's going on? Why should we be interested in it? Or in all the different ways that you have now internalised as to why this is particularly important. In relation to this title, it might be about the protest, it might be about the thing they're protesting about, it might be about where they're protesting, and what's the significance of all those three things for later on. Within that broader context, you then go, okay, of all those things, and I'm flagging up maybe 2 or 3 things there, and maybe I've got a question about each of them. So from that broad introduction, here are my questions, which you may have kept the ones from your research proposal, or they might have been modified slightly since then. And then, as we've talked about, what approach are you doing? Well, in this case, I was interested in why people were protesting, why they cared. I wanted to know their values and their interpretations. So I was taking broadly a social construction approach to this, and broadly using semi-structured interviews, participant observation, etc. So the sorts of subjects I'm interested in immediately connect to the right questions I'm asking. There's a synergy between the approach that I'm taking and the methods that I'm doing. Hopefully you're beginning to feel that resonance in your own work. Everything connects together. These aren't just separate sections. And your introduction is the opportunity for you to just synthesize it all together. Okay. This last point, I think, might be the one that you're going, really? Do I have to do that? Yeah. But it's really good that you can. What original contributions do you seek to make? You can think about this question in terms of, well, why should anybody apart from you and your nearest and dearest care about this subject? You clearly care about it. It is of significance to you. It has meaning to you. Try to articulate that meaning under some different headings. I'm completely aware that not everybody's dissertation will be able to, or needs to, make a contribution under each of these headings: empirical, theoretical, methodological, or policy. But if you can do 1 or 2 of those, then that's great. But ask yourself that question. Why? What was particularly interesting about my case study? Empirically, am I contributing new knowledge to a particular empirical area? Bit vegetarian, bit this, bit that, bit other. Theoretically, am I doing something interesting? Has the data that I've got said that these ideas about youth cultures and liminality, or whatever it happens to be, are limited in a certain way? Am I adding something, a new spin, a new idea to this that people who are looking at this subject after me ought to take into account of? Methodologically, am I doing something interesting? This might be something that not everybody's work fits into, but maybe you've done a new type of ethnography. Maybe you use social media in a new way. Maybe you've pictures in a new way. Maybe you've encountered an odd ethical situation that you can offer a new insight into. Maybe you're doing work in relation to planning, or broadly a policy about, I don't know, public spaces, or how different genders or people or bodies engage in the world in a different way, issues of regeneration, whatever it happens to be. And you could say, perhaps the policy, in light of the work that I've done, ought to consider X, Y, and Z in a more significant way than it's done to date. Because in your case study, this is what it's shown. So it's trying to connect your work back outwards again. You remember that wine glass idea we used earlier in the module? Your intro and your conclusion is that opportunity. Well, you started wide, and then you get narrow in your little view, etc., etc., and you get wide again in your conclusion. What I'm kind of seeking here is to go back to the biggest sense of all. Why should your reader be interested in your subject? Okay? Okay. You all right with that? Good. Now, oddly, what I've talked about in relation to introduction, you can simply mirror and think about for your conclusion. Think about the introduction and conclusion almost like bookends on your shelf, and all the stuff in the middle is the intro and conclusion holds it together, keeps it upright, offers a bracket, offers a border, offers an enclosure to make sense of it. If in the introduction you said, this is what I'm hoping to do in this work, this is what I'm setting out to do, this was my plan, in the conclusion chapter, you're saying the same things, but in the other sense, this is what I did. This was a dissertation that set out to look at X, Y, Z, it used these approaches, it used these methodologies, it sought to find this, and then, as you've seen from my empirical chapter, these are its key findings. And you can summarise those things. So, in a way, it's a mirror of the introduction. If this was my focus, these are my aims. A brief summary of my findings that I've taken you through. I find it useful to start here when you're writing your conclusion because it gets you going. You're going to have that brain freeze that we all have when we sit down on a blank sheet on our screens and go, okay, I might have just, in a few days previously or whatever, I might have read through my whole dissertation and gone, okay, there's this point and this point, I know they're clear. Okay. Sometimes writing it like this way is almost retreading your steps and gets you going. Okay. My dissertation was about, it set out to answer these three questions. Okay, this is going, I know this, this is fine, this is safe. What did I find? Oh, well, to answer question one, this is what, okay, I can take my conclusion from that chapter, put it in again. Okay, I'm getting going, and it's working. But then, this chapter does some other things beyond that, okay? And the other things beyond that are, okay, you have to acknowledge that this work is not perfect. There might have been some limitations to it. Now, those limitations might be simply because you didn't have a research army at your behest. You didn't have multi-millions of pounds to draw upon. You had you and a few months and just your own resources. So you might say, well, actually, if I was doing this again, I'd broaden my case study. Or I'd triangulate these methods along with those methods. Or it would have been really good if I could interview the Prime Minister about this. But he wasn't available. He had better things to do at the time. And you're thinking, well, that's a way in which I can acknowledge the relative limitations of my study. Now, I don't want you to start hitting yourself with birch about this and really beat yourself up about it. You don't really want to do that. You want to acknowledge, honestly, some of the things you could have done better. Part of this process is that you're not experts at this yet, but you've become relative experts through the process of doing it. So even what you know now, and say, well, I wouldn't have started off my interviews like that before, or I would have made sure I had a backup recording device because that one only recorded 10 minutes and wasn't that annoying. This is your opportunity to flag up the lessons that you've learned and something that you've got from it. But put it here, in my view. Don't put it right at the end. Don't leave the reader on a relative down note, okay? So acknowledge it and then go, but although these were the relative weaknesses, wow, the stuff that I found. This stuff was really interesting because, right, these are the significant, and the point I'm making about reflecting back to the introduction, these are the things that I found. Although my recording device didn't work, I still got some really interesting issues about attitudes to X, Y, or Z, which informs methodology. It was really interesting methodologically because, or in terms of policy because, or empirically because, no one's ever looked at the case study I've looked at before. Even though I'm using exactly the same methods that everyone else has done, blah, 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 blah. No one's ever looked at this case study in Cardiff or in Kuala Lumpur or wherever it happens to be before. And that's the thing that I'm adding. That's my original contribution. So make that claim. Make that claim under any or all of these headings that suit your piece of work. But that's a really kind of strong, positive, punchy end to your piece of work. And although that might offend your modesty to kind of claim stuff, your job almost is to trumpet your findings and say, demonstrate the significance of them. And even if, as I say, that kind of you don't wish to be so kind of bullish about it, think about that in a different way. Think about the people who've given their time to fill in your survey, or to be part of your focus group, or to travel with you, or to be interviewed by you. You owe it to them to make sure that you are as clear and precise and as advocatory, if that's a word, an advocate for their ideas as you can be. So if you think, oh, I don't really want, I'm too shy, you've got to do it on behalf of the people that have given you the data. Okay, it's not you, it's the data speaking. And your job is just to simply speak the truth of your data to the marker. All right? So, in your conclusion chapter, the relative limitations of the significance of your work and the recommendations that could be made as a consequence of that. As a consequence of the recommendations for policy or for the way in which we should go about research projects, whatever it happens to be, you can then almost restate a new set of questions about your study. Well, I found this. Wouldn't it be really interesting to ask this question? Or to go further, to extend the work? Because really, now, through this work in process, I've come to realise that I've only really done half a job. It's a great half job, but now I'm almost defining the work as a much larger project. And this is where you can almost be hypothetical in nature, just ask some questions that you know you're personally never ever going to ask, or you might be doubtful that someone else might never ever ask. But it might be the thing that turns into your postgraduate dissertation. It might be something that turns into your PhD, or you spend a whole career looking at this stuff. You know, this kind of that exhilaration, that ecstatic jubilation that Gibbons was talking about in the first part. Well, actually, through this process, I've uncovered this whole topography of inquiry that I can do. There are new questions that to be asked. And your conclusion is the moment where you articulate them to the reader. Okay? That's what they're going to be looking for in this chapter. Now, you know, I said that it's often useful to start with this point to get yourself going in the conclusion as you write it. I would say that these bits are the most important. So if you are suffering on word length, then personally I would start writing it like that, and then I would edit it down and be ruthless about this bit. So this could be half a page, it could be 3 lines, it could be a whole page, it could be 2 sentences, depending on the amount of words you've got to play with. And because this is the stuff, you can't edit this stuff out. You need this stuff. Okay? This is the stuff that I just like to see in there. And I like to write it because it gets me into the groove of what it is that I should be doing, the purpose of the chapter. Okay? Any questions about what we've talked about thus far in relation to the intro and the conclusion? Are we good? We could go and do it now? Yay. So, final drafting then. As you begin to start thinking about your intro and conclusion, one of the things I hope you'll do, that you kind of might be common sense to do, is to go back and read through your intro, your method and your empirical chapters almost in chronological order, to draw out, sift through some of the key statements that you might be making. So this final drafting process, as you're trying to get towards a final draft, that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about to hopefully cover all the bases that you'll need in the last few weeks of doing a dissertation. One of the things you might wish to consider as you're going through this is what the markers will be looking at, or be looking for as they go through your piece of work. So these are kind of six key points that are taken directly from the mark sheet that will come back to you when you have your marks in the spring. Okay? And there are almost six key headings that staff look at when they think about dissertations. And so let's go through them. The first question, how well defined is the research topic? Are there clear aims and objectives? Is the research question, is it a focused focused research question specified. This all effectively, when myself and my colleagues mark pieces of work, this is aligned to the introduction. It's almost each of these questions aligns to a section of the piece of work. So the things that we've just been talking about in relation to what makes a good introduction are conflated under this point. Is a spatial phenomena well identified that made me interested in it? Have they got clear questions that engage with that phenomena? Have they introduced an approach to the research that makes sense? All that goes under question 1. Number 2, has the existing literature on the subject been examined? Is there a critical review that covers the key sources on the topic? It doesn't take a genius to see that is the next chapter. That's the literature review. Okay, and all the things that we said what a literature review should be. Then, has an appropriate research strategy or methodology been devised for the study? Does the method fit the questions? So that refers to the next chapter, the methodology chapter. And then, next one's going to be about the empirical analysis, right? Is there evidence of sustained analytical approaches to the research topic? Does the author go beyond simply description in presenting the results and interrogate existing knowledge? Begin that conversation between the lit review and the empirical data. And then, are the conclusions relevant? Are they sound? Do they come from the analysis? Is there an obvious connection from the data that you've produced and the conclusions that you're drawing? Do they pose interesting questions for future research, etc.? And then finally, is the dissertation well written, referenced, illustrated, presented? Is the dissertation properly proofread, etc.? Those issues we'll come to, but almost like the things that just make it nice. Is it well presented? The stuff that Mary Berry would have liked on Bake Off. Has it got a nice ribbon round it? Does it look and feel? Is there a je ne sais quoi about the dissertation, just perhaps in the writing style? An opportunity for the member of staff writing it to comment on those things that might elevate a dissertation out from they're doing all the core things right, and there's just something about it that just flies. It's just magical. That's in the 6. Now, I just want to give you an insight into, well, one person's approach to marking. There are these 6 key sections, right? And I once went through this process of thinking about how does someone mark? It's not really, it's kind of a scientific process because we've got these things to go through, but there's a kind of things that kind of go beyond it and difficult to quantify. There's a human dimension to it. So I think, well, this is what I've ended up doing to almost sense check my feeling. I go through a dissertation and I have a kind of ballpark figure in my mind. And because a lot of our undergraduates, a lot of our assessment stuff is categorically marked, it's quite easy to kind of identify zones. Well, I think this is it feels like a 2-2, or it feels like a 2-1, or it feels like a first. And then you start going, okay, if it's a first, for example, is it a high first, or a middle first, or a low first? You begin kind of putting things into zones. You're thinking, well, if the literature review is really strong, the methodology, not so much, analysis, all that goes back to the quality of the lit review. So how do I mark down the method? Because if the method's a bit dodgy, is the method dodgy in terms of the choices that they've made, or simply in the way they've articulated their choices? Because if the method's really dodgy, then the analysis is going to be dodgy, right? Because they're all method choices. So you make all these systems. So you kind of get to the end and go, oh, it feels to me like a 68. And then for me, I've actually gone through quietly and gone, given a mark for that, given a mark for that, and then I get my calculator out, do it, and then do the sum and divide it. And oddly, it's always within like 1 or 2 marks of that feeling that you've got for the work, and then the actual marks for each of these sort of sections. And I tell you that interesting story. Wasn't it interesting? Yes. Because I'm sure some colleagues do that more systematically. Think so. Actually, all these things are important. Your dissertation can't carry a really rubbish lit review, or and get through on the basis of because they all speak to one another and they'll have these conversations between one another. Try and make that consistency well between them, because you don't want effectively first fail. Because even if the maths worked out, they ended up passing. Having one of these sections that didn't work just doesn't feel right. An analogy that's just popped into my head. A mate of mine did a PhD, and she worked so hard on his and a lot of these questions, etc., and a lot of the criteria for assessment are just the same for a PhD as they are for an undergraduate. You know, it's the same sort of thing. And her conclusion chapter was really bad. She said, I only spent like 2 days on it, and you know, for a PhD it's like 3.5, 4 years work, and they just failed the whole thing because their conclusion was rubbish. Now I've got to the end of that anecdote and I'm thinking, that's not the thing I should tell you, because that really puts the fear of God into you. I didn't mean it for that intention at all. Do what I said about the conclusion and you'll just be completely fine. But I guess my point is that as you are going through and finalising your final draft, make sure that you're bearing these questions in mind, and making sure that any oddities in the drafting process you have ironed out to make sure everything is as good as you feel it can be. Okay. I'll go through a whole set of miscellaneous slides now that are all relevant for your dissertation as you're going through this final draft. So point number 1, 10,000 words is the suggested number of words and the suggested word limit. Okay, so I've had a lot of emails from students saying, is this 10%? Formally, there is no school policy that allows for 10% over any assessment. Okay, that doesn't mean there might not be some for some individual modules. It just means there is no school policy that says going over 10% is okay. That's not written down anywhere. Okay, so similarly for the dissertation, 10,000 words is 10,000 words is 10,000 words. Of course, however, and apart from those occasions when it's not. So, the word count does not include appendices, all the front pieces, the abstract, the contents pages, etc., that I'm going to go and show you in a few slides' time. It doesn't include your footnotes. It doesn't include your references. It doesn't include any tables, or the content list of tables and graphs, etc. Now, as I was putting this lecture together, there was a discrepancy in the advice, and this is the bit that I was saying, use the advice that I'm giving you now, not the advice on the slides that I put up, 3 or 4 days ago. Because, as we will see from this page, you will have to put a declaration on the front of your piece of work that says, I certify that my own original work, unless otherwise specified, this is my own original work and does not exceed 10,000 words, excluding tables, references, and appendices. So the declaration that the university requires you to put on the front of your dissertation says that my work does not exceed 10,000 words, but I'm not counting tables, references, appendices. The previous PowerPoint I put up said that tables were included in your word count, but the declaration is giving you contrary advice. So we need to go with this. Okay? So for my money, tables, graphs, figures, not included in your dissertation. And that's where you have a degree of wriggle room. That's where the urban myth that there is a 10% leeway comes from. Because sometimes some dissertations will have pie charts and histograms and all that sort of stuff, and you're thinking, all those little labels, do I have to count up all those little bit of words? No. Okay? So that's where you can either play a smart game with put things in figures, or actually just keep your life simple and just say, if it's a word in a sentence, in a paragraph, I count it. If it's not, I don't. Okay? There's also this situation that said you could lose marks. I'm trying to be as honest and open with you as possible. It is very rare for a member of staff to count your words. Okay? But just in that sense that I was saying before when you were marking it, markers get a sense of a good dissertation, a mediocre dissertation, a poor dissertation. They have supernatural powers, all right? They can kind of go, God, this feels long. And if it feels long, then they will check. Okay? So if it's over by 10 words or 20 words or even like 200 words or 5, maybe, I don't know, then you are playing a dangerous game, put it that way. Okay? Because if it ends up with 12,000 words, and you said it's 10,000 words, notwithstanding the odd figure here and there, and someone goes through and highlights all the text and ends up that it is way over 10,000 words and you said it's not, that's not great for your academic integrity. Okay? You will be penalised on your mark as a consequence of that. There's no direct penalty, but in the same way that your structure was really poor, then you would expect some mark to be taken off. Okay, a 65 turns into, I don't know, a 58 or something. I don't know, because you haven't put together the work well, right? So don't get the fear about it, but use your common sense, okay? You're supposed to be able to do it within 10,000 words. So long as you don't really abuse that, it will generally be okay. But there's a cut-off for that reason, notwithstanding the caveats that I've described. Is that broadly understood? We good with that? Okay, cool. So, it includes the titles in the chapters, the subheadings, the quotes from your interviewees, your in-text citations, but not your tables, your graphs, all that stuff. All right? And that will play out differently with different people depending on the sorts of data that they have. Okay, so with all that in mind, you can see now where the kind of the expandable or contractible nature of the introduction and conclusion chapters you can do at the end to make sure that you fit that broad overall goal. Okay. As you're going through this final and reading everything, okay, what should you bear in mind as you're doing this? Thinking, okay, words, one of the things, but is there a constructive alignment between the chapters, the questions that I'm asking, the literacy that I'm using, the key points that are coming out of my data, and the conclusions that draw directly out of my questions? Can I put a conclusion or a recommendation directly from each of my questions? It's just almost being logical and systematic about it. Might be reassuring and make sure that you've not left anything out. Has anything changed since when you've started? I mean, you might have been talking about, I don't know, racism in public life or something, and Islamophobia in the Tory party, or what Boris Johnson has said recently, or what Prince Andrew said about the white man, or what Stormzy is saying about Grenfell or whatever, suddenly become really relevant, but it's only happened in the last month. Do you need to go back and integrate something that has just happened, that restates the importance of your dissertation, makes it more important than you thought it could ever have been 6 months ago, 9 months ago? Just be aware of major significant changes and include them if they're necessary. This might be including them in your introduction chapters and that's the only time you mention them. It might only be in a footnote. But what you should be thinking is, if I don't acknowledge this, will the marker be asking me a question about why haven't they talked about that? We're talking about monarchy and business and you're not mentioning Prince Andrew's interview on the BBC. Do you know what I mean? Connect that stuff back in. Go through and think, okay, does it read well? Does it read clearly? Does it read grammatically correct? We all have our own styles in relation to this. We all have our strengths and weaknesses in relation to this. But as long as you are, at the very least, turning on your typo bits on your computer and acknowledging that, so it's just not littered with obvious everyday mistakes, notwithstanding issues of dyslexia, of course, because they'll be flagged up and they won't be penalised for those students who have those conditions. Is your language clear and explicit? Does it cut to the chase? As you're thinking about the editing process, am I saying things multiple times? Am I saying things in a really long-winded way or in a really precise and concise way? I tell this, apologies, those might have heard the story before, but I did a essay, an article for a journal, and I thought, like an idiot, that it was 9,000 words long. So I wrote it as 9,000 words long. And the editor wouldn't even look at it. He said, you do realise that we only accept papers of 6,000 words in this journal? Oh, what an idiot. What an idiot. You guys won't make that mistake. But I thought, okay, this is an interesting exercise, I tried to tell myself. And I went through one afternoon and just cut words out of it. And I lost 3,000 words without even trying. And it was a better piece of work as a consequence. I lost a third of it, people, just by cutting out things that I'd said more than once. Or the sentence was that big, and I think, well, I'd just lose that bit, or take that bit out and that bit out, and it's that. And it says what I need it to say. And then lots of other blurby stuff around it. Would you believe that I can write in a long-winded way? I know it's a big leap, isn't it? So you can go through it and you will be surprised. You won't have made as bad a mistake as I made in that example. But you probably can lose quite a lot of words if you get your editing head on rather than your writing head on. And actually, almost after the semester's bit of teaching is finished and you go back home and you're sitting in kind of with a few days rest and after the Christmas festivities and read it afresh, you kind of go, crikey, that's a long-winded sentence. I can just cut that down. And my word count thing has sorted itself out through the editing process. Have I presented it as well as I wish to? Now, you're thinking, well, it's only John and someone else reading it, or whoever's your supervisor or your marker's going to be. But it's worth thinking about these things. And here's an interesting example as to why. So a student last year, Emily, did her work on Virgin Galactic, and I know some of you are aware of this piece of work and might even be aware of this image before, but it ended up being read by Richard Branson. So it would have been really annoying if she had left loads of typos in it, or if she spelt his name wrong, or it wasn't presented in the way that she'd really like it to be presented, because that might have foregone her opportunity to work in the company that she wanted to work at in the British Virgin Islands. So, who knows how big the ripple of the waves from the ripple of your dissertation will travel. Try to just put it together in a way that, is cool. Then you can get signed. Very well done. Hopefully you and many other students will come astronauts one day. Richard. And then Branson in. Because, you get to stage, even when you're a multi-millionaire, global superstar, say, it's me, Branson. You remember? So many Richards. Never get too big for our boots. Okay? You need to do all that stuff, but you super need to put in your ethical approval form. Okay? Your ethical approval form is a fundamental thing. You don't have it, you risk failing. It doesn't matter how brilliant it is. Put it in. Okay? Put it into your appendix. And reference appropriately. It's one of the things that, always my Achilles heel as well. I kind of put, I know where that was. Add in quotation. I know, add in source. You guys do that, right? And then you kind of go, where is that? And it takes me like 3 days to find that one annoying quotation. And the page number, because it's a direct quotation. Put it into the text. Make sure it's in your bibliography. You may be surprised how often markers check. They do check. Okay? And they often check because they're super interested in your work. They go, I've not read that. Oh, where's that? It's not there. If that one's not there, how many others are not there? You've got my interest now. I'm going to check all of them now. So people will check. Do that boring but necessary work at the end of it to sense check your dissertation to make sure you don't trip up the last hurdle. Okay? And if you need any reminding about how to source, how to cite in text, all that sort of stuff, your Boxing Day, you're full of your Christmas dinner, and you're thinking, I'm going to do my referencing. Don't. Click on the link. All the information's there. Okay? There's support for you to do it. Okay. So, this is some stuff that won't be relevant for more of you, but just common slip-ups that people use. It almost doesn't matter if you use the first person or the third person, but what it does matter is that you're consistent in your use of it. Okay, so consistency, consistency in referencing, consistency in tense, consistency in your general approach to it. So I collected data is fine. In this dissertation, data was collected upon. Both are fine. Okay, just don't mix and match them. Try to be inconsistent because it just jars the reader. Also, there's things, don't say we. It kind of alludes to the fact it might not be your own piece of work. Why do you want to confuse your marker saying, is this really your piece of work? Inconsistent tenses. So if it's be all past tense or present tense, but keep the same tense. That's another kind of thing that just is annoying, it's minor, but try to be consistent about it. Try not to use slang too much, although there are some pieces of work that use slang to their strength. So again, this is just general advice. So things that it's almost having your best phone voice on in writing style, rather than being slang and casual, unless it's directly relevant to the topic that you are investigating. And don't use overly verbose sentences. This is a really good example of what I was describing about how I simplified that article that was way too long. I could say it can be postulated by undertaking an examination of data. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 words, or I could just say data analysis suggests 3 words. Crikey, do that 100 times in your essay, then in your dissertation suddenly you haven't got a word count problem at all. Okay? So think about where you're falling over yourself to say something in what you deem to be an academic-y way, when really simple is best. All right? Bingo. Okay. How are we doing for time? Okay. So, things that need to go in just because they do. You need to have this front material. Your front page of your dissertation is your title. It has your student ID on it. It has the date, your module code, and the word count. It needs those things on. You can put other stuff on it if you want to, but you need to put those things on it. Okay? So you can put in a picture, smiley face, whatever. You need to have a declaration, which I'll get to in a minute. And you also need to have an abstract on one of these front pages. And your abstract, what, half a page-ish, normally about, I don't know, 150, 200 words. That, if you think of your introduction is a summary of your whole thesis, then the abstract is a summary of your summary. It's the academic version of a tweet about what your dissertation is about 150 words, not 150 characters. Okay? This is a dissertation about this. It asks these questions, or it takes this approach to look at this spatial phenomena, and it's going to draw key findings about FNAF. Okay? If you're in doubt at all, there are lots of dissertations to look at, or any academic paper always has an abstract, and you're following that sort of idea. Becky?
Is the abstract included in word count?
No. So none of these front pages stuff is, you'll acknowledge all this stuff not in your word count. Just when chapter 1 starts, that's when you would go from, all right? So you can expand if you wish to, but conventionally it's a paragraph. Okay? Then you can have a contents page, just because it makes sense, and actually, you know, if I'm reading it, I go and have a cup of tea, I have to go and do something else, think I've got to the end of the lit review, okay, that just makes it easier to navigate your piece of work. It's just an etiquette that we follow. And then you can have an acknowledgement. And this will obviously be to the brilliant module leader of the research dissertation module, but probably more likely those people that have supported you through your dissertation, either your stakeholders, your family, your mates, who've just kept you sane through the process. This is an opportunity for you to acknowledge those people and say thank you. So if your mum ever reads it, she can just, oh, bless, for all those months and months and months of support she's given you. That's a time to say that stuff. All right? And none of it in your word count. This is that declaration that it has been, up until this point, you can do it in any form you want, but you use this form of words for your declaration. Just formally saying that you're not wholly abusing the word length, and it's your work. You're not plagiarising, you're not engaging in unfair practice. This is the work that you have put all the hours in up until this date. Okay? So you can type your name in, you can add an electronic signature, it really doesn't matter, but mark your cross on there. Appendices and formatting. There is no real right or wrong about what you put in your appendix, but you need your ethical approval form somewhere in your piece of work. An appendix is an obvious place, so you don't have to use that in your word count. Okay? So I would suggest you have a minimum of one appendix, and it's your ethical approval form. And if you've only got a hard copy, then scan it. But I'm guessing some of you will have electronic copies, so just drag and drop and stick it in there. You could put your interview transcripts in your appendix. You could put a survey in the appendix. Of those two things, it's far more likely and probably more expected to have, if you did an online survey or any sort of survey, or indeed an interview schedule, why not just put that in an appendix? It just enhances the information that your reader has about how you went about asking your questions. Your transcripts, however, will be far more bulky and long, bluntly far more a hassle for you to tidy up to make sure they're in readable form for somebody else. So personally, I wouldn't put my interview transcripts in, okay? But if you wish to, you can, okay? You might do that because you're thinking Richard Branson might read it and you want him to read that stuff, you know? But generally speaking, there's no need to do it, okay? So given the amount of work you've got on, it's probably one thing that can just be put to the sidelines. But if you've got any questions, this is the moment, the next couple of weeks is the time to chat it through with your supervisor and personalise this advice in relation to your individual dissertation. Okay? From the handbook, it says that you should try to do your work in size 11 or 12 font. You can do it in any font you want, but just make it presentable. Arial and Times New Roman, as we know, are the normal things. Try to do it a space and a half or double spaced, just because it's so much easier to read when you're staring at a screen, and most people will be reading them on a screen. You don't want line upon line upon line. You just want to put your marker in a good mood, right? Leave a gap. It's so much easier. And you will submit the final piece of work in a Word or a PDF font, and put page numbers on it too, just because it's like contents page with page numbers. Have all that stuff all tied together. Okay, it's kind of, we're getting into the real common sense stuff now. And you will submit it on Learning Central. And to confirm, the new deadline, Monday the 13th at 1 p.m. Okay? Don't be late. You can submit earlier if you wish to. Generally speaking, the submission button will be set up probably by the end of the teaching semester, mid-December-ish, and you will get a Turnitin report, etc., etc., just like any other piece of work that you've done. In relation to the same as any other piece of work that you've done, there might be problems. It's incredibly rare, but you may not wish to submit your piece of work at 12:30 on that Monday, simply because if the internet is playing silly billies right then you're going to have a panic. So think about that stuff. Also think about when the actual university is completely closed, okay, not just when your supervisor up the 22nd, but the university will be completely closed, no security, no nothing, from basically Christmas Eve up until Thursday the 2nd of January. So if you had a question for IT, or if you had a question for the Student Hub, no one's going to respond until they're back in work on the 2nd of January, and those are the people to contact if there is some completely outlandish issue about submission. Okay, so they're your points of contact, and they will be able to support you through that. Okay. Yeah. Hopefully you'll have all the information that you need to go through it. You guys are now experts in doing dissertations. You guys have common sense about what you're going to do. Rely on that. Trust in your judgment. You can always contact student services, etc., after the supervisory deadline, but use that time up until the end of your supervision to tailor the advice that you need from your supervisor to make sure that you are confident in finishing off this piece of work. You've got the skills, now you've got to do it. Just do it. I want to say good luck then, so effectively good luck. The last thing I want to formally say to you before you'll disappear is there are 2 forms of evaluation that the school would really appreciate that you do in relation to your dissertation. And please deal with them as separate supervisions. One of them is separate evaluations. One of them is in relation to this module, this relatively short 4 or 5 sessions that has sought to give you the generic support that hopefully has been useful in getting you through the last stages of your dissertation. I'll email you through Learning Central when that evaluation comes live. So please make every effort to fill it in, because anything that you tell us will feed into next year's and will support that next year's group. I know you're going, oh, next year, what do we care about next year? You know, with every year, if we can keep improving, we can make sure that there are no obvious problems with the module. So I personally really appreciate if you could fill in that module evaluation when it comes through. The second evaluation will be about your supervisor. Okay? Now, so it's important to think about, you've got your supervisor on one hand and the generic module on the other hand. Keep your comments about your supervisor to the supervisory one, and your comments about the module advisory one. It's important to note that they're probably both open broadly at the same time, but your supervisor won't get your feedback until after the process of marking, etc., etc., etc. And generally speaking, it will be anonymised anyway. So they're not going to know. If you want to really, you can fill out the rest of that sentence yourself. If you want to offer professional constructive criticism about your supervisor, feel completely within your liberty at doing that without fear of any sort of repercussion. There's going to be no repercussion, but we need to know as a school if there are problems with your supervisor that from your perspective they can learn from and be better. If we don't get that feedback from you, it's really difficult for other staff members to know which of our colleagues aren't necessarily doing it in the way that the other staff members would like them to do it. Okay? So if you can offer give praise where it's due and give constructive criticism where it's due, that would be really appreciated as well. I know it's another thing that you do and it's don't really want to do it, but it does make a difference, so I would really appreciate if you could do it. Okay, I'm going to be around now, so ask me any questions that you like, but have a good the rest of the semester and best of luck with your disc finishing up.